The War of Algeria's Independence. It was the 100 years of expansionism. The countries of Europe fanned out across the globe looking for benefits and in the process enslaved huge districts of the earth, ravaging the land, annihilating old societies, dislodging neighborhood dialects, changing old traditions. They played with the countries of Asia and Africa as though they were playing with pieces on a chessboard that could be caught and eliminated off the board voluntarily. Individuals of the colonized domains were pawns, peasants, best-case scenario, and slaves to say the least, their assets at the removal of the colonizing power, their predeterminations chose in European capitals a huge number of miles from home. In spite of moving coalitions in Europe, the pilgrim structure held. The chief pilgrim powers were the United Kingdom, France, Russia and the Netherlands. Constantly a large portion of the 19th century there was an expansive comprehension between these forces about states and districts of impact. The construction held until the start of the 20th century when the disappointment of the set-up domains to oblige the rising force of Germany hastened the Great War and spelled the start of the finish of the pioneer world request. The 20th century saw a rising tide of hatred contrary to provincial standard. Political developments emerged requiring the privileges of the colonized individuals. It was a lethargic, convoluted and difficult battle. The frontier powers were dove in. They delighted in overpowering prevalence in innovation and military force. The pioneer request was supported by humanism of strength which arrogated the privilege of the European competitions to control the world. The expression, the white man's weight, was developed to communicate oneself arrogated right of the Europeans to socialize the locals. On the other hand, the colonized individuals came up short on the association, the establishments and the assets to defy the pioneer request. Any similarity to powerful obstruction was squashed with a substantial hand. It was solely after Hitler's conflict, with the pioneer controls monetarily bankrupt and militarily depleted, that individuals of Asia and Africa saw the light of liberation and opportunity. Of the relative multitude of nations that accomplished freedom in the promptly post-World War II period, Algeria stands apart as an awful display of the mercilessness of provincial standard. Indeed, even a depleted France was reluctant to surrender its hang on its settlements. After its loss and ejection from Indochina, 1954, France was much more determined in clutching Algeria. Endeavors at changes and proposition for coordination of the province with mainland France were suppressed, leaving no alternative to the patriots except for to stand up to. The resulting War of Independence, Guerre d'Algérie 1952–62, was probably the bloodiest battle of the 20th century. Evaluations change, however, as per history specialists, somewhere in the range of 500,000 and 1,500,000 Algerians died in the contention. More than 2 million in a complete populace of 10 million were constrained out of their homes and put in inhumane imprisonments. French armed force misfortunes were roughly 28,000 dead and 65,000 injured. A large number of European pioneers lost their lives. The conflict was described by torment and fierceness against the Algerian Muslims and fear with respect to the opposition. In a long and extended trial of wills, the French won the tactical struggle, however lost the political fight. The end of threats and freedom opened the conduits of exiles from North Africa into France. In excess of 1 million escaped, many were Frenchmen, others were Algerians who had agreed with the French during the conflict. The kids and grandkids of the North African workers comprise an unwanted presence in France and face fundamental separation in the place that is known for their reception. Their essence shakes the social and political texture of France even right up till today. Algeria is the core of the Maghreb. Arranged between Morocco toward the west, Tunisia and Libya toward the east, Mali and Niger toward the south, it is an enormous North African country, second in size just to the Sudan. The Mediterranean coastline, 600 miles in length, has fine harbors situated at Oran, Algiers, Skikda and Annaba. The Atlas Mountains run from Morocco through Algeria into Tunisia. The good countries and the seaside territories get a moderate measure of precipitation. The heft of the country in the south is important for the Sahara with inadequate precipitation, little vegetation and not very many residences. Oil disclosure lately has expanded the essential significance of this huge and ruined area. As a piece of the Mediterranean world, Algeria has been battled about and settled by many more than one flood of trespassers. The nearby individuals, the Berbers, have occupied the land from ancient occasions. Around 800 BC, Phoenician mariners showed up from the eastern Mediterranean and set up the city of Carthage, situated in current Tunisia. The city developed prosperous through exchange and in succeeding hundreds of years set up a solid city-based state and a realm that rode the coastlines of the Maghreb and Spain. In the 2nd and 3rd century BC, Carthage was an enemy of Rome and a challenger for power in the Mediterranean. The Romans caught the city and obliterated it in the year 146 BC, and the Maghreb turned into a piece of the Roman Empire. Algeria was a silo for the Romans. Urbanization developed. Famous men graced the land. Among the significant greats was Saint Augustine. In the year 698 CE, the Arab general Hassan ibn al-Numan crushed the Byzantines, Eastern Romans, at the skirmish of Carthage. North Africa fell before the steady walk of the Arab armed forces. A joined Arab-Berber armed force crossed the Straits of Gibraltar in 711 CE. Constantly 732 CE, Spain and southern France had been consolidated into the distant domain. Islamic impact took roots, and by the 9th century, North Africa and Spain were transcendently Muslim. During the Islamic time frame, the Maghreb was controlled by progressive administrations including the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Aqlabids, the Fatimids, the Almoravids, Almohads and the Marinids. After the fall of Granada in 1492, Spain pushed its force across the Mediterranean and caught a few ports along the Mediterranean coast. The Muslim overlords engaged the Ottomans for help. A long arrangement of fights guaranteed. By 1570 CE, Ottoman force was completely settled in North Africa to the extent the realm of Morocco. The Battle of Lepanto, 1572 CE, captured the extension of Ottoman maritime force. In any case, succeeding endeavors by the Christian Iberians to colonize the Maghreb were beaten back. In 1588 CE, Emir Ahmed al-Mansur destroyed an attacking Portuguese power drove by King Sebastian at the Battle of Al-Qasr al-Kabir. From there on, in spite of incidental invasions by the Christian Iberians, the hold of Islamic domains on the Maghreb held, with the Marinids, Wattasid, Sardis and Alawite administrations in Morocco, and the Ottomans in Algeria, Tunisia and grounds farther east. Until the 19th century, Algeria was the western territory of the Ottoman Empire and was a wellspring of labor for the Ottoman naval force. It was likewise a grain overflow territory. A lead representative, Dey, designated by the Sultan in Istanbul, controlled the area and went about as the parleying expert in a pyramidal construction upheld by nearby property managers and effective vendors. Due essentially to its distance, the region was to a great extent self-sufficient. It was separated into 4 locales, each administered by a bey. The Napoleonic conflicts, 1798 to 1812 CE, delivered colossal energies in the European mainland and gave a catalyst to the supreme extension of the extraordinary forces. The debilitating Ottoman Empire was the desired prize. There was agreement between Britain, France and Russia that the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. Notwithstanding, there was no arrangement with respect to how to destroy it and who might control its pieces after it was destroyed. The Russians enjoyed the benefit of topography. They pined for the Caucasus, which gave admittance to the Black Sea. They additionally squeezed their cases as defenders of the Eastern Orthodox Church, whose supporters framed a larger part in the Balkans. The amazing Russian plan was to arrive at the warm waters of the Mediterranean and make their territory-based domain a world realm. The French had their eyes on North Africa. The essential objective of Great Britain was to ensure its fledgling Indian realm by controlling the land and ocean courses prompting the Indian Ocean. Henceforth the British had the double points of containing the Russians and upgrading their own advantages in the Middle East. The 3 great powers played a stupendous game, then again coordinating and contending with each other. The frontier history of Algeria starts in the year 1830 CE. The Ottoman Empire was depleted from the Russian-Turkish conflict of 1828–29 and had surrendered Georgia, Armenia and the Caucasus to Russia, while tolerating Russian impact in Serbia, Romania and Bulgaria. The Greeks had pursued their conflict of freedom, 1828–1830 CE, and with consolation from both Britain and Russia, had severed from the Ottoman Empire. The incredible legislative leader of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, straightforwardly tested the authority of the king, sending his militaries into Syria and Anatolia to remove concessions from Istanbul. Detecting a memorable chance, the French took their action in North Africa. The underlying French push had the double points of containing theft in the Western Mediterranean and improving its business advantages around there. Utilizing a fake affront to the French representative in Alger as a pardon, the French naval force assaulted the city, and after a savage fight, involved it in 1830 CE. With the city of Alger as a base, the French armed force fanned out across the Mediterranean coast. The Algerians battled frantically yet missed out against the predominant combat hardware and control of the French intruders. A group who had raised the pennant of freedom, balance and society scarcely an age back, presently turned into the culprits of the most exceedingly terrible sort of denials of basic liberties. The conflict against the North Africans had gotten at science, in which better innovation was utilized than subjugate whole countries and clans. Torment was utilized as a weapon to separate the opposition. So dangerous was the French surge that the number of inhabitants in Algeria diminished from 3 million of every 1830 to 2.5 million out of 1840. By the mid-year of 1834, the French controlled the whole northern bank of Algeria and announced it to be an indispensable piece of France. Algerian opposition proceeded. As has frequently occurred throughout the entire existence of the Maghreb, it was the Sufis who waged war against the trespassers. In 1558 CE, the Jazulia Sufis marshaled the Moroccans to overcome an attacking power drove by the Portuguese ruler Sebastian. In 1835 CE, it was the Qadiriya Sufis. Sheikh Abdul Qadir was the head of this opposition. He was brought into the world in Oran in 1807. His dad was a notable Qadiriya sheikh. In the wake of contemplating the Quran, tafsir, rationale and theory, he continued to Mecca for Hajj and on his way back visited Baghdad to visit the burial chamber of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani and other awliya. After getting back to his country, he discovered it under occupation. He waged war and with the assistance of clans in the western Algeria, offered fight to the trespassers, exacting one loss upon another on the French, 1932–37 CE. Sheikh Abdul Qadir was courageous to the foe as he was fearless in fight and won the esteem even of the intruders. In 1937 CE, a détente was finished up between the different sides, permitting the French to keep Alger and Oran, however holding the hinterland free under Sheikh Abdul Qadir. After 2 years, the French singularly broke the détente. Utilizing overpowering power, they sought after Abdul Qadir's powers, consuming, assaulting and utilizing boundless torment as they went. Contenders and regular people escaping the propelling French covered up in caverns. The French utilized smoke bombs to flush them out or murder them. Sheikh Abdul Qadir gave up in 1841 on a guarantee that he would be permitted to remain in Algeria. The French broke the guarantee and the sheikh was ousted first to France and afterward to Damascus, where he died in 1883. Colonization obliterates the old social, monetary and military collusions and makes new ones, hurling afterward new verifiable freedoms. So it was with Algeria. The control of the northern coast pulled in pilgrims from southern France searching for new monetary freedoms. Colonization made another class of French administrators under obligation to the pioneers. The old Ottoman gentry, where neighborhood landowners and financial specialists stood firm on high footings, was annihilated and got docile to the French administration. In time, the agreement of the pioneers, called the colons, and the French regulatory machine made an amazing campaign which no administration in Paris could dismiss. Despite the fact that Algeria was attached, it was lawfully not a piece of France, but rather was regulated as 3 divisions. The colons had portrayals in the French parliament, however not the Muslim Algerians. The uneven political connection between the occupier and the involved made a relating irregularity in the monetary and social conditions on the ground. Agrarian land claimed by Algerians was seized, regularly discretionarily, and given to the pilgrims who amassed enormous estates and developed wealthy simultaneously. The dislodged Algerians had to become workers and workers for endurance. As financial inconsistencies developed, so did the social gorge between the pioneer and the local. A social science of separation arose which supported the monetary and political definition as a characteristic request. The provincial conflicts had the roundabout result of French entrance into the inside of the country. The approach of land seizure and its dispersion to the colons was presently stretched out to the Atlas good countries. The nearby ranches were progressively crushed into less useful terrains. Customary focuses of force-dependent ashore proprietorship were obliterated. The Algerian rancher had no real option except to turn into a tenant farmer ashore possessed by the colons, or to move to the bigger urban areas along the coast and look for work in humble positions working for the settler Europeans. The French control of Algeria gave the exemplary indications of expansionism, and was described by raging prejudice, strict dogmatism and manipulative free enterprise. The European pilgrims, Christians outsiders from France, Spain, Malta and Italy, peered downward on the Berbers and Arabs who were overwhelmingly Muslim. The Muslims, who established 95% of the neighborhood populace, were deliberately barred from work, lodging and social administrations. Political and monetary force lived only with the Europeans. The pioneers took over the greater part of the decision land and changed over it into estates for cash crops. Streets and schools were assembled, yet these were for the Europeans, as it were. An Algerian Muslim could enroll in the French armed force and was allowed to shed his blood for the domain. However, he was unable to turn into a French resident except if he was able to surrender his devotion to the Sharia. Customary schooling dependent on the madrasa framework was obliterated, while admittance to French instruction was confined. The utilization of Arabic language was debilitate and its place taken up by French. Lack of education expanded such a lot of that in 1960, following 120 years of French standard, just a modest amount of Algerian Muslims could be viewed as proficient. The Algerians were not only peasants, they were not residents at all in their own territory and were considered by the pioneer Europeans as close to serfs, deserving of kind belittling, best-case scenario, and hatred even from a pessimistic standpoint. The abusive strategies of the French generated a few rebellions. In 1871, the Kabyle clans in the eastern Sahara ascended under the authority of Sheikh al-Haddad of the Rahmaniya Sufi request. The reason for this revolt was the augmentation of colon rule over saved Muslim towns. There was likewise broad starvation because of a supported dry season. The French authorities were careless and never really improved the circumstance. Battles in Europe and expanding trade among Algeria and France had driven up the cost of Algerian wheat to world market levels, and the laborers had offered their stores to theoretical French hoarders. The organization reneged on its guarantee to propel credits to the ranchers to recharge their seed grains depleted by long stretches of starvation. In excess of 200,000 Algerians died in the starvation. Sheikh al-Haddad announced a jihad against the French, assembled a power of 100,000 tribesmen and walked on Constantine. Lacking present-day guns and the control of current armed forces, the uprising was rapidly down and Sheikh al-Haddad was caught. Following the insurgents, the Frontier Organization established cruel rules against the Algerian Muslims which authorized self-assertive capture and detainment, revocation of the option to gathering and extreme discipline for the smallest lack of respect to French authorities. The French government knew about the developing social and political uneven characters, however, was partitioned on the issue of Algeria. The French sovereign Napoleon III made a weak endeavor to stop the discretionary capture of Algerian terrains in 1863, yet needed to cancel the actions despite aggression from the settled-in colons. In the frontier request, the Algerian Muslim had two negative marks against him, one since he was an Algerian, and the other on the grounds that he was a Muslim. The unfair laws had an unequivocal strict point to them. The Sephardic Jews were conferred full citizenship in 1870 as though to announce straightforwardly that religion was a vital rule in the unfair and severe arising frontier request. Christians and Jews could turn out to be full residents, not so the Muslims. The rules offered French citizenship to a small bunch of Muslims gave they surrendered their devotion to the Sharia. This was equivalent to surrendering their religion, and few Muslims took up the offer. The Franco-Prussian conflict of 1880–81 was a debacle for France. The Prussians unequivocally crushed the French, took Napoleon III prisoner, and involved Paris. The German states were solidified into a solitary state which arose as the most grounded power on the landmass. France lost Alsace-Lorraine and had to pay a reimbursement of 5 billion francs to the Germans. The Third Republic that arose in the result of the Franco-Prussian conflict was too powerless to even consider withstanding the pressing factors of the colons in Algeria, who were instrumental in getting the Code de l'Indigène went through the French National Assembly in 1985. The code sanctioned oppression Algerian Muslims and extended the forces of the colons. Seizure of Algerian terrains continued unabated. The developing force of the Europeans pulled in additional migration from southern Europe. Another settled in European character arose in North Africa, more decided than before to keep Algeria French and keep a tight top on the yearnings of the local populace. The recess between the conflict of 1880 to 1881 and the First World War was a time of provincial solidification. There arose in Algeria a two-layered socio-political construction with the French and the colons at the top and the Algerian Muslims at the base. The Sephardic Jews were considered privileged Frenchmen. Each gathering had its own advantages and its own political plan. The French government, licking its injuries from the Franco-Prussian conflict, knew about the financial and political state of its Algerian subjects, yet was too powerless to even consider doing anything about it. The colons, resolved to protect their advantages, were stubbornly against any concessions to the Algerians. The Algerian Muslims, persistently crushed financially and politically by the colons, progressively disdained their condition, however were frail to do anything about it. The deteriorating social state of the Algerian Muslims was shown in their instructive backwardness. The old madrasa framework was obliterated by the French. Lycées, or secondary school like those in France, jumped up in North Africa, however these were saved for the French and the colons. The Algerians were hesitant to send their kids to the lycées in case they instill outsider qualities. Be that as it may, regardless of whether they needed to, Algerian Muslim youngsters were not wanted in French schools. The instructive backwardness was generally obvious in the dominatingly Muslim hinterland, which got little interest in the instructive framework and was, best-case scenario, treated with benevolent disregard. The beginning of the 20th century saw the pioneer realms at their peak. The British were the foremost force on the planet. The French influence over North and Western Africa was unchallenged. The Netherlands had an iron hold on Indonesia. So secure was the political construction that the most that the local populaces in the provinces could want was a territory status inside the realms. Autonomy was no possible. The Pilgrim powers yielded nothing with the exception of posturing. Any trace of genuine political opposition was mercilessly squashed. The Second Great War was a conflict that no one needed. The European forces staggered onto it through a progression of errors. Serbia pined for Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was controlled by Austria-Hungary after the Ottoman capitulation of 1886. The refusal of the Austrians to give up their control of Bosnia-Herzegovina was the guise for the death of the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo, 1914. The death of the crown sovereign couldn't go unpunished, thus Austria, with the inferred endorsement of Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, pronounced conflict on Serbia. Russia, which was a partner of Serbia, and self-proclaimed defender of its Eastern Orthodox populace, announced conflict on Austria. Germany, a partner of Austria, proclaimed conflict on Russia. The French saw in the guaranteeing war a chance to win back Alsace-Lorraine. Along these lines, France proclaimed conflict on Germany. The German militaries sliced through Belgium, progressed on Paris, expecting to bargain a lethal hit to the French as they had done in the conflict of 1880–81 and carry the conflict to a speedy end. Incredible Britain, worried that the overall influence in Central Europe was moving unyieldingly towards Germany, proclaimed conflict on Germany. English domains and states including Canada, Australia and India participate. An impasse created on the Franco-German front. The Germans persuaded the Ottomans to join the fight on their side with offers of gold and the possibilities of winning back the Balkan territories lost in the conflict of 1911. Russia exited the conflict after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. There was a danger of a unified loss and relinquishment of credits which the United States had progressed to the partners. The United States, which was at first non-partisan, entered battle in 1917 incompletely because of German submarine assaults on its overseas transportation on the side of the British conflict exertion and somewhat to guarantee that the partners would reimburse their obligations to Washington. A solitary death subsequently transformed into a world fire. The computations of the relative multitude of significant forces demonstrated erroneous. The Great War delayed for a very long time and depleted the economies and labor of the European forces. More than 100,000 Algerians fought for the French in the war, along with troops from Tunisia and Morocco. Thousands gave their lives defending Paris. Many thousands more perished in the trench warfare that pitted contesting armies towards the later stages of the war. The North Africans had hoped that their sacrifices would improve their political status within the French Empire. The American President Woodrow Wilson had articulated a 14-point program which promised self-determination for the colonized people. Nationalists in Afro-Asia, from India to Morocco, had pinned their hopes that a successful outcome of the war in favor of Britain and France would improve their political prospects. This was not to be. The Allies did win the war. Germany surrendered in August 1918 and was forced to pay enormous war reparations. Alsace-Lorraine was back under the control of France. The Ottoman Empire was occupied and dismembered. Woodrow Wilson, who attended the Victors' Conference in 1919, left disillusioned with the scheming of the European powers. France occupied Syria and Lebanon. Britain took Palestine and Iraq. Protests against colonial rule were brutally suppressed in India, Jallianwala Bagh, 1919, Syria, Damascus, 1920, and Algeria. It looked as if the colonial edifice, which looked imposing at the turn of the century, had received further reinforcement as a result of the war. But the picture was deceptive. The seeds of the next war were sown in the humiliating terms dictated to Germany. The colonial people, having fought for their masters in distant lands, grew restless. The movements towards autonomy and independence gathered momentum. The First World War contributed to the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. The impact of this event was global. A host of communist movements sprang up in Asia and Africa, deriving their inspiration from the success of the Bolsheviks in Russia. The communist rhetoric had its appeal to the colonized masses that were at the receiving end of unbridled exploitative colonial capitalism. In some of the larger countries such as India and Indonesia, the communists became important players in the ensuing struggle against colonialism. Communism also made inroads into Algeria. However, there was a difference. Whereas the communist parties in India and Indonesia were homegrown, those in North Africa found their voice only through the Communist Party of France. The presence of a large European colonial population and the repressive political environment they fostered precluded the formation of effective political parties on home turf. One of the earliest Algerian nationalists who tried to break out of this paradigm was Messali Haj Abdul Qadir. A grandson of the legendary Algerian resistance fighter Sheikh Abdul Qadir, Messali Haj, 1898–1974, grew up in the town of Tlemcen. Drafted into the French army, he fought in the waning years of World War I and experienced firsthand the discrimination faced by native troops in the French armed forces. Presence on French soil exposed him to new and exciting political ideas. Returning to Algeria in 1921, he held a series of menial jobs under appalling conditions which reinforced in his young mind the wide disparities in the living standards of the French and the Algerians. He returned to France in 1923, settled in one of the North African shanty towns on the outskirts of Paris, married a French woman who was a member of the Communist Party, became a small businessman and set about giving a voice to Algerian aspirations. Political opinion of the Algerian émigré population had split into two camps. One camp sought accommodation with France and ultimate integration with French society. These were the elite, the highly educated and successful businessmen. The other camp, consisting of small businessmen, workers and petty bureaucrats, wanted autonomy. Messali Hadj worked with the latter group. In 1926, with encouragement from the Communist Party of France, he founded the Étoile Nord-Africaine, North African Star. He gave forceful expression to North African aspirations in a declaration read at the Socialiste Internationale Conference in Brussels, Belgium in 1927. It was here that he first put forth a demand for Algerian independence. The French, apprehensive of the growing popularity of Messali Hadj's views, dissolved the Étoile Nord-Africaine in 1929. The party went underground and continued its activities. Hadj Messali founded a journal El Omar which found wide readership among the Algerian émigré communities as well as Algeria itself. Hadj Messali tried to combine his socialist rhetoric with Islamic themes so as to broaden the appeal of his message to the working masses as well as the learned ulama in North Africa. The continued political assertiveness of Hadj Messali was viewed with suspicion by the French establishment and he was sentenced to jail for 6 months in 1933 on charges of illegal political activities. It was a time of great economic dislocations in Europe. The Nazis had come to power in Germany, riding on a wave of mass unemployment and economic collapse. America was in the grip of the Great Depression. The French needed social peace on the home front. Accordingly, the government of France proposed minor reforms to allow a handful of Algerian Muslims to become French citizenships. These proposals were viewed with favor with the elites who favored integration with France. Hadj Messali traveled throughout Algeria and in speech after speech roused the people to oppose. The proposals were abandoned because of the determined opposition of the colons. Hadj Messali founded the Party of the Algerian People, PPA, in 1937 but it too was suppressed by the French and he was jailed until 1945. The Second World War intervened. Hitler's armies occupied Paris, the Vichy government set itself up in southern France, and as part of the armistice agreement with the Germans continued to govern the North African colonies. Algeria witnessed the same repression against the Jews and the Communists as did metropolitan France. The tide of the war turned in 1942 with the American entry into the war and in 1943 Algeria firmly in Allied hands. General de Gaulle set up the headquarters of the Free French Forces in Algiers and there it remains until the liberation of Paris in August 1944. More than 200,000 North Africans saw action during the war as part of the Allied forces. Discriminated, ill-equipped and treated with racist contempt by French officers, these soldiers, often recruits from villages, fought with valor in the Italian and French campaigns, even while the vaunted French corps of the Fifth Republic collapsed and were taken prisoner by the Germans. The colonial order placed these brave men in a class of subhumans, to be used to preserve and perpetuate the very colonial regimes that suppressed them. The Provisional Government of the French Republic, GPRF, was no less hostile to Algerian aspirations than its predecessors. Algerian resentment, contained by decades of repressive measures, was like pressurized steam in an airtight kettle. The lid came off immediately after the war. On May 8, 1945, the day that Germany surrendered, the Muslim population of Sétif took out a procession to celebrate the Allied victory. Scuffles between the marchers and the Europeans broke out as the procession made its way through the French Quarter. The situation got out of control, riots ensued, and in the mob violence that followed, more than 100 colons were killed. In revenge, the French army went on a killing. Muslim quarters were raided by the army accompanied by vengeful colons. Mountain villages around Sétif were strafed and bombed. Estimates vary, but the Algerian chroniclers estimate that over 40,000 civilians were massacred. This was a turning point in the struggle for independence of Algeria. The violence and its fury disillusioned moderate Algerians, and political opinion began to shift in the direction of armed resistance. Meanwhile, on the continent, Haj Messali was released from prison and he founded a new political party, the Mouvement pour le Triomphe des Libertés Démocratiques (MTLD). Even though he remained the most conspicuous spokesman for Algerian independence after the war, the struggle was moving ahead of him. The Sétif massacres had convinced many in the younger generation that France would not willingly relinquish control of its North African colonies. Disillusioned, they turned increasingly to armed resistance. Ahmed Ben Bella, a rising star in the anti-colonial struggle, founded the secret Organisation Spéciale in 1947, whose purpose was armed resistance to French rule. Ben Bella is considered the father of Algerian independence. Born into a poor, religious family in Tlemcen in 1916, Ben Bella joined the French army in 1936 as a way of advancing his career. After the fall of France in 1940, the French army was demobilized. Ben Bella volunteered to serve with a regiment of Moroccan infantry and fought in the Italian campaigns. Returning home after the war, he participated in the assembly elections of 1947. French interference in the elections convinced the young Ben Bella that peaceful emancipation from colonial rule was impossible. The Organisation Spéciale carried out sabotage of French installations. Ben Bella was arrested and sentenced to 8 years in prison in 1951. He escaped from prison and found his way to Tunisia and from there to Cairo, Egypt. In 1952, Haj Messali was arrested once again, and the MTLD fell apart. It was obvious that France had no intention of withdrawing from Algeria, and it was apparent that the older generation of Haj Messali was becoming irrelevant. Frustrated, young Algerian men deserted the MTLD in droves. In October 1954 they formed the National Liberation Front, FLN, with a military wing Armée de Libération Nationale. The War of Algerian Independence had begun. On November 1, 1954, a group of FLN nationalists struck at French military and civilian installations. On the political front, the FLN established its headquarters in Cairo and with the support of Gamal Abdel Nasser obtained access to Radio Cairo and the Arab masses. As the uprising began, the FLN broadcast an appeal to all Algerian Muslims to rise up against French colonial rule and establish a sovereign, democratic and socialist state in accordance with the principles of Islam. The nationalist appeal was packaged in Islamic terms so as to have the broadest appeal to the peasants, the intellectuals and the ulama alike. France was reeling from its defeat at Dien Bien Phu and the loss of its Indochina colonies. It was in no mood to entertain independence for Algeria, a province that it had long considered a part of itself. The reaction of the French government was to dig in and seek a military solution. This was a grave miscalculation. France's repressive rule in Algeria for over 100 years, characterization by discrimination, violence, neglect and exploitation had used up the patience of the native Muslim population. But even at this late date there was a substantial section of Algerian population that was willing to seek an accommodation with France, perhaps some form of association or even integration. A political solution might have worked. But the history of French rule in Algeria was long characterized by racism and blindness to the rights of the Algerians. It was astonishing how even well-meaning Frenchmen could claim Algeria as part of France while keeping the native population in a state of perpetual servitude, without political rights or education and employment opportunities. Over the years, even modest attempts at reform were torpedoed by the entrenched colon lobbies in Paris. The die was cast. The cup was full and events moved inexorably in the direction of armed conflict. Violence begets violence. In retribution for the riots at Sétif, the French army and the colony perpetrated widespread massacres. This in turn nurtured Algerian resentment and armed attacks on French installations, inviting more vicious retribution in return. The colons were particularly vicious, carrying out deadly raids on Muslim quarters in which innocent men, women and children were slaughtered. The moderates who sought an accommodation with France were increasingly marginalized. The Algerian merchant in the coastal cities as well the farmer in the highlands came to the conclusion that armed struggle was the only way to throw off the French yoke. What was a political issue became a war of attrition with increasing ferocity in which it was hard to separate the victims from the victimizers but in which the Algerian Muslims were the primary sufferers. Even in the midst of this mayhem, the voices of moderation were not silent. Ferhat Abbas, the moderate nationalist, who prepared the Algerian People's Manifesto in 1943, founded the Democratic Union of Algerian Manifesto, UDMA, in 1946. This party stood for political accommodation with France and a resolution of the conflict based on dialogue and compromise. In the initial phases of the War of Independence, during 1954–55, Ferhat Abbas and his party were lukewarm towards the armed insurrection. So were the ULMA. It was not until 1956, with positions hardening on both sides, and avenues for compromise exhausted that Ferhat Abbas joined the FLN. The FLN did not represent all shades of opinion in Algeria. The veteran Messeli Hadj, miffed at not being consulted by the FLN, founded the Mouvement National Algérien, MNA, in 1954 as a rival organization to the FLN. The MNA found support among Algerian émigrés in France and also received covert support from the French government to weaken the influence of the FLN. A war of attrition between the FLN and the MNA ensued spanning both sides of the Mediterranean Sea. Many thousands died during the so-called café wars in Paris between the protagonists of the two political parties. Ultimately, the Armée de Libération Nationale, ALN, the military arm of the FLN, gained the upper hand, and the MNA lost out on both political and military fronts. Using Cairo as its base, the FLN organized its political and military activities with the dual aim of soliciting Arab public support and compelling the French to the negotiating table. Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt was an ardent Arab nationalist and the FLN received his blessing as well as his full political backing. In the anti-colonial atmosphere of the post-World War II world, the Algerians also received moral and political support from the emerging Afro-Asian countries. The FNL set up a Comité Révolutionnaire d'Unité et d'Action CRUA in Cairo. Its 9 executive members, Ait Ahmed, Ben Bella, Rabah Batat, Mustafa Ben Boulaid, Mohamed Boudiaf, Murad Didouch, Mohamed Qaida, Belkacem Krim and Labi Ben Mahidi formed the brain trust behind the revolution. Local political committees were established to influence workers' union, students, intellectuals and women's groups. For effective armed action, the CRUA divided Algeria into wilayas and kasbahs with local commanders assigned to each cell. The decentralized units were autonomous and could initiate military contact at opportune moments. It was classic asymmetrical warfare, which pitted a diffuse, highly motivated insurgency against a centralized, modern French army. Thanks for watching. Bye now.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to Life is Often if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.